Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Magdalena Barcelon from the Coalition for People's Right to Health. We are streaming live on the Facebook pages of the Coalition for People's Right to Health, Council for Health and Development, and Bantay Bakuna. We are also streaming on the Facebook pages of our official civic media partners, Now You Know, and Rappler, Move.ph. So, welcome to everyone to this briefing on the status of our call for waiver of the TRIPS for technologies related to the COVID pandemic. Our sponsors for this morning are the Coalition for People's Right to Health, Bantay Bakuna, People Over Profit, Rappler, Now You Know. So thank you and welcome to our media, to our friends from media. We are conducting this public briefing because in order to urge the Philippine government to make a definitive stand on the call for waiver on the TRIPS for the TRIPS negotiations, which will be held on October 12 to 13. So for our first speaker, we have Dr. Joshua San Pedro from the Coalition for People's Right to Health.
All right, thank you very much po. Thank you po, and good morning to everyone. Again, the Coalition for People's Right to Health is welcoming everybody to this to our public briefing and press conference on the TRIPS waiver. Just like our previous discussions on the TRIPS waiver, we'd like to highlight the role of the Philippine government and many other governments in ensuring the TRIPS waiver's passage at the World Trade Organization. But of course, we'll just go through a short discussion as well on the updates as well as the situation with regards to our TRIPS waiver campaign. So before I start, again, I'm Josh San Pedro of the Coalition for People's Right to Health, also a member of the People's Vaccine Alliance Asia, the People's Health Movement Philippines, and the Council for Health and Development. So so just a short backgrounder. So what is the TRIPS waiver? So the TRIPS waiver is a proposal that was filed by South Africa and India initially, last October 2, 2020. So it's been more than a year since the TRIPS waiver was initially proposed. So why did they propose this? So we know that that medicines, diagnostics, vaccines, are all items considered for trade by the World Trade Organization. So since the early 90s, the World Trade Organization created a framework for the intellectual property rights. So the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or the TRIPS agreement, was formed in the mid-90s, and then eventually was put into was enforced by the early 2000s for all countries who signed the TRIPS agreement, which is every WTO member country. The TRIPS ensures that there are intellectual property rights related aspects of the items of trade, including drugs, medicines, and technologies. Because of these, there are rules governing patents, there are rules governing trade secrets that in order for these items to be traded around the world. No? So because of that, um, there had to be some arrangements, no, and some flexibilities, no, especially with when there are health emergencies, such as what we saw with HIV in the early 2000s. However, these hardly really make a dent, no, on the on our on the health situation of many individuals. No? So, despite that, no, despite all the problems with TRIPS flexibilities, that there's still very limited parallel importation. There's still very limited uh, compulsory licenses, no, which allows pharmaceuticals in other countries to create these drugs, no, or make generics for free, or even cheaper, no, in for people to access. The TRIPS ensure that these countries have that the countries and the corporations who create the new technologies, the new medicines, the new vaccines, will be able to patent it, no, for at least 20 years. No? And sometimes they can even be extended. But unfortunately, that causes a bottleneck in the access. No? And that's something that we see now with the COVID-19 pandemic. No? So the TRIPS waiver is a way of improving access. It is a way of decreasing the monopoly of many multinational companies who are in charge really of the development and the production of these medical technologies. So we just want to situate everything, the TRIPS waiver and the Philippine situation, especially in this worsening COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. So the Philippines, as many know, we have been seeing record highs yet again, although the cases have been decreasing now. But cases have generally been increasing across Southeast Asia. But as of late, no, has been slightly decreasing in terms of its trend. But despite that, no, the Philippines still leads the Southeast Asian region in the number of new cases and the number of new deaths. No, so the data came in late yesterday from the Department of Health. So this is what we saw. Now again, we had 12,159 cases. It's leading in the Southeast Asian region. Although we are not the highest in terms of active cases, but we are second in the total cases in our Southeast Asian region, in the ASEAN. So testing, contact tracing, and isolation still remains insufficient. No, the access to these products, to testing equipment, the access to contact tracing technologies is still very poor in the Philippines, and this leads to community transmission. There remain a lot of unreported and untested cases and deaths, and we have never really reached near zero cases, no, unlike other countries who have reached near zero. No? So our average of around 16,000, no, is never really near zero. So only around 20% of our population has been fully vaccinated. Despite everything, we see that we are still also the leading country in terms of COVID-19 cases and deaths in the WHO Western Pacific region, which the Philippines belongs to. No? We are not part of the Southeast Asian region in the WHO, but still, no, we can see in the Western Pacific region, the Philippines is leading in terms of total cases and total deaths. Okay, so the Philippines has seen a lot of hidden deaths behind COVID-19. So this is something that we saw really in 2020. When we compare what 2020 has in the deaths in 2020 compared to the past 5 years, no, 2015 to 2019, though COVID-19 is basically the seventh leading cause of death in 2020. In May of in the latest report of the first half of 2021, it has jumped to the fifth cause of death in the Philippines. But we are seeing also increases in other causes of deaths compared to the past 5 years, in lifestyle and chronic diseases, both directly and indirectly caused by this pandemic. And this is also caused by the decreased access to essential health services, or what we call the COVIDization. Most health services are focusing solely on COVID-19, and usually there is a neglect of the other illnesses that we are seeing. But at the same time, when hospitals become overloaded with COVID-19 cases, the limited capacity really points towards the patients who are most critically ill, those who need more of the critical care, are serviced first. There are also significant increases from other deaths in our country in the past compared to the past 5 years. We saw an increase of HIV related deaths, almost 100%, almost double compared to the 5-year average. There's also an increase in indirect obstetric deaths from malnutrition, accidental poisoning, and unfortunately even intentional self-harm or suicide. So now, we are seeing the news, that the Philippines is apparently one of the worst places to be with COVID-19. We saw that the Philippines ranked 53rd among 53 countries in the Bloomberg Resilience Score. Although this was only had 53 countries in the study, we can see how low the Philippines scored in terms of the Bloomberg Resilience ranking, which is based on vaccine coverage, lockdown severity, flight capacity, and vaccinated travel routes, which it scored last among the 53 countries. This was dismissed by a lot of health officials by saying that it's only 53 countries. However, just a few weeks later, we saw that the Philippines also ranked last in the Nikkei Recovery Index. The Philippines scored 121st. Now it scored 30.5, the lowest, or 100 of 121 countries in the Nikkei Recovery Index as of September 30, 2021. So the Philippines ranks the lowest, not just among 53 countries, but apparently even among 121 countries. And this has a lot to do with our COVID-19 response. So the Philippines also has the most number of approved vaccines. The Philippines has 10 approved vaccines, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Sinopharm, 2 Sinopharm vaccines, the Sinovac vaccine, 2 Gamaleya vaccines, Sputnik V and Sputnik Light, Janssen, Bharat, Moderna, and another, the 11th, is still in process, which is the Novavax vaccine. But still, we can see here that despite the Philippines having the most number of approved vaccines in the world, we are still very far from vaccine equity. As we can see, in October 2, the anniversary of the TRIPS Waiver, the Philippines had only vaccinated less than 20% of its population. So the Philippines is still far from our target of herd immunity, but also far from our target of vaccine equity. So the Philippines is relying a lot on donations through COVAX and from bilateral donors, such as the United States. And at the same time has been loaning so much for the procurement of vaccines. And this just reflects the Philippines' lack of local production, and the Philippines is really approving as much vaccines as it can get to try and get as much supply the soonest possible time. And I think the CPRH has mentioned, and I've discussed before, that this is perhaps the clearest example for the Philippines to really need the TRIPS waiver, because despite the regulatory approval, despite the procurements that depend on so much loans, it doesn't really guarantee the vaccine and health equity, given that we have so much unequal distribution, not just across countries, but even in our country. And there is still massive profiteering. It's still very expensive. We are loaning so much. We are paying funds that we don't really know, because of non-disclosure agreements. But and yet, so many multinational companies are actually profiting from the vaccine production because it is so limited. But we can see now that the Philippines, given the situation that we are, one of the worst countries to be in terms of the scores, and despite that, we have the most number of vaccines, but it does not translate to better outcomes. So the Philippines seems to be defensive and yet helpless. No? We keep on mentioning that 80% of the vaccine supply has already been purchased by the rich countries. It is unfair, and we are scrambling, no, for the vaccines, and yet we also are defensive that it's not really the low rank. No, it's not our fault alone. No, it's because countries are different. It's because countries are have different situations. No? So we are unable really to accept the criticism and really understand the discourse. No? The inability to secure vaccine doses is also indeed a supply issue, but we do not really question, no, the larger status quo. We agree. We recognize that there is a lack of a local vaccine industry and production, no, to augment the supply. But unfortunately and curiously, the Philippines still has minimal discussion of the TRIPS waiver in its official pronouncements, and especially among local and social media. So there's very little discussion on what the TRIPS waiver aims to do. And yet people clamor, no, looking for the vaccines, no, aside from the financial aid that is clamored for during these difficult lockdowns. So the TRIPS waiver again is a proposal at the World Trade Organization, and since the World Trade Organization votes on consensus, no, it needs many countries to agree. No, and this is the latest data as of July, but with some changes that were added. Like Australia has actually now agreed, no, for the TRIPS waiver. The United States, Russia, China uh, have all, no, supported the TRIPS waiver, as well as France, New Zealand, and many South American, African, and Asian nations. No? But despite that, no, the some data recognize the Philippines as a supporter, as a general supporter, but that is actually our question. No? That's a big question in terms of whether this is really true. No, but we can see, no, many other countries have actually full out supported, no, even sponsored or co-sponsored the TRIPS waiver proposal. So it's no longer a South African and Indian proposal. It's also a proposal by many African groups, by many Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, and even South American countries. No? So Indonesia, for example, and I believe Vietnam has also become a co-sponsor of the TRIPS waiver that wishes to remove, no, the intellectual property barriers for COVID-19 technologies. So in the Philippines, what are we hearing? So I mentioned there's very limited information. In May, the Department of Trade and Industry only pitched voluntary licensing. This is what I mentioned earlier, the compulsory licensing, which allows for local producers to make vaccines only if they have the the full agreement, no, of the manufacturing company, which is part of the TRIPS flexibilities. No? And this is something that the DTI has been pushing for, that we should do voluntary licensing instead, no? And not unilaterally. No? They are still concerned that without the approval of the lead pharmaceutical company, is that there will be some problems with trade, no, and intellectual property rights. So thus, they are not actually supportive, no, and are actually reluctant for the TRIPS waiver, since they believe that there is a slim chance, no, that it will be approved at the World Trade Organization. Other agencies, such as the Department of Health, has actually voiced its support, no, in removing the intellectual property rules that can address inequality, no, in the access for vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. This was mentioned by the Department of Health at the 74th World Health Assembly, representing the country. In Congress, there has been a filed resolution in June, no, or House Resolution 1831, filed by the Makabayan Bloc, urging the Philippine government to unconditionally support, no, the TRIPS waiver. But unfortunately, up to now, no, has not been discussed on the committee level. The Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines is also again urging caution on supporting the TRIPS waiver because it might, no, according to one of their officers, it might have implications on Philippines' obligation in international trade agreements. The Department of Foreign Affairs, however, did mention, no, in an international forum in China that the Philippines did want to back, no, the intellectual property waiver, no, at the World Trade Organization. This was mentioned in August. In the Senate, no, this was reported in September, but apparently the initial resolution filed by Senator Hontiveros in October 2020 was now adopted, no, by the Committee on Foreign Relations by Senator Pimentel officially, no, last July 6, 2021. But it actually just urges, no, the Philippine government to just to suspend the implementation and enforcement of the TRIPS locally, no, but there is really a need, no, for a government stand, no, the TRIPS waiver. There has been a most recent statement in October 4. This is after the CPRH released its message on October 2 on the TRIPS waiver anniversary. The presidential spokesperson was asked, no, whether the government does support the TRIPS waiver, in which he said that the Philippines is in agreement with the with wanting vaccine equality and vaccine equity. No, the presidential spokesperson, Secretary Roque, also mentioned, no, that erroneously, no, that this was a suggestion by the United States. No? So again, this is initially proposed by the South Africa and India, but was also backed by the United States earlier this year. So, like I mentioned, it's been more than a year since the waiver proposal was passed, and up to now, no, the talks are still deadlocked, no, at the World Trade Organization, and there will be a TRIPS Council meeting on October 13 to 14, no, in Geneva. So we are still at the deadlock. We are still waiting, no, for the Philippines to really categorically state, no, that the Philippines is supporting the TRIPS waiver in Geneva, no, and it actually wants to discuss that, no, even in local media, even in social media, and in official pronouncements. So previously, the coalition wrote to Ambassador Tihanki and will be writing again, seeking the support, no, for the passage of the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization. And again, we want to clarify that this is not just for vaccines. No, the TRIPS waiver wants to remove for at least 3 years, no, the patent rules on medicines, diagnostics, and technologies. No? And we see that how the Philippines really needs this, especially for the prevention, treatment, and containment of COVID-19. No? We're seeing stocks running out, not just of vaccines, but even of medicines, even of technologies for the swab tests, the PCR tests, and we lack, no, a lot of technologies in contact tracing. Now, we really need, no, as much as possible, better access to this. And one example is to really remove, no, the intellectual property rights when it comes to these aspects during a public health and economic crisis. So, okay. So basically, aside from the update, with the TRIPS waiver, I wanted to also show, how the TRIPS waiver is actually pushing for the right to health. And I will end on this note that the Constitution of 1987 stated that the state must promote and protect the right to health of the people and instill health consciousness among them. And the TRIPS waiver is definitely one of those ways that will instill health consciousness, that will protect and promote the right to health, and that will make states accountable, to their people in ensuring this this right, to be healthy during this public health crisis. That the situation in the communities call for such a radical change, that dapat lapat, dapat the response, must be grounded, must be proactive, and must be enabling for the people. So the Coalition for People's Right to Health has long called for the changes in our healthcare system in this pandemic response, to make testing and treatment free, and we can only do that by removing the intellectual property rights on these essential treatment, on this essential uh, testing access, no, and making these cheaper and more affordable for the government to provide for its people. We need better contact tracing genomic surveillance. And again, this technology is unfortunately very difficult to get, and that will, and removing the intellectual property barriers, removing the patents, removing the such rules on trade, will be able to provide this better in more countries beyond the Philippines. Oops. We want to napalawakin at pabilisin ang pagbabakuna. We want to make vaccination faster and more widespread. And again, this cannot happen unless we have enough vaccine supply. And vaccine supply is definitely one of the cornerstones of the TRIPS waiver. And of course, part of the right to health is really ensuring the financial aid and assistance for everyone, including aid for quarantine, paid quarantine leave, and financial aid for everyone affected by this pandemic and its lockdowns. And ultimately, to raise the bar for our healthcare system, to increase its capacity, which is definitely responding to the right to health. And this is something called, again, by our situation in the communities. Kaya dapat lapat sa kalagayan, dapat sa komunidad. Ito ang magpapatunay na meron tayong karapatan sa kalusugan. And the state must ensure the right to health during this pandemic and even after, by raising the bar for our healthcare system. And that is what we are calling for. That the TRIPS waiver is one of those definite ways to really ensure na lapat na that our situation and our pandemic response is enabling, grounded, and is proactive for our people during this very difficult time. So with that, I end my part. So I just want to mention as well that we originally invited the Commission on Human Rights to discuss as well. But they send their regards. But unfortunately, because of the passing of Chairman Gascon, they decided to they have more urgent matters to, but they send the regards with regards to our forum and ensuring the right to health, which is very much in line with the campaigns of human rights and how the TRIPS waiver plays a very big role on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Josh, for sharing the update on the status of the waiver here in the Philippines. So we'd like to thank again our sponsors, co-sponsors for this event, the People's Vaccine Alliance, the People's Health Movement. Dr. Delen de la Paz is with us now. Thank you. And then also our media partners, Now You Know, and RapplerMove.ph. We are live also on Facebook at the Cure COVID page and Council for Health and Development, and the Bantay Bakuna, also among our sponsors. So we'd like to thank also our friends from the media who are here, from GMA and Mr. Mark Makalalad, and those who are also monitoring us through Facebook Live. So for our next speaker, we have Dinah Fuentes-Pina from the People's Vaccine Alliance. She is the media co-lead for campaigns and media co-lead for People's Vaccine Alliance Asia and the campaign manager for Action Aid International. So Ms. Dinah Fuentes-Pina. Thank you.
Thank you po. Good morning, and thanks everyone for having me. Thanks especially to the CPRH for having me. This is indeed a privilege to be here this morning. So good morning, everyone from Bangkok. As Doctor said, my name is Dinah Fuentes Fina. I'm with ActionAid International, based out of Thailand, but I'm originally from the Philippines, din po. So thank you so much. I'm also a co-convener of the People's Vaccine Alliance in Asia, and also a part of the People's Vaccines Alliance globally. So of course, you know that since the COVID-19 pandemic was declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization more than a year ago, it has unleashed a crisis of multiple dimensions that continues to massively impact health and economic systems around the world. While solving these crises requires system change, an urgent, life-saving first step is to fight the pandemic through free, fair, and equitable access to vaccinations. So the People's Vaccines Alliance is a coalition of organizations and activists united under a common aim of campaigning for a people's vaccines for COVID-19. This would be based on shared knowledge and should be freely available to everyone, everywhere. This is what we call what we say that that COVID-19 vaccines should be a global common good, should be a global public good. So what is currently the situation of vaccinations? Josh has stated earlier as to where we are at with regards to vaccinations globally. So the PVA has calculated that if current trends continue, it will take the world's poorest countries until 2078 to vaccinate their populations. It's only 2021 now. So that will be 57 years before we can curb this pandemic if current trends continue, if current vaccination trends continue. About 77% of shots that have gone into arms worldwide have been administered in high and upper middle income countries. Never have I seen an inequality this stark globally. Only 0.5% of doses have been administered in low income countries. Meaning, just 2% of people living in the world's poorest countries have been vaccinated. This while the majority of people in rich countries are fully vaccinated. And you must have seen in your Facebook newsfeed that some countries are even starting to roll out booster shots or even starting to inoculate their kids. The grotesque inequality in access to COVID-19 vaccines and technologies continues while 10,000 people die of the virus every day. You even have a country like Liberia that has only vaccinated 0.2% of its population. This has led to a striking divide between regions of the world, Africa being having the slowest vaccination rate of any continent, with just 7.1% of the population receiving at least one dose of a vaccine. So how would the TRIPS waiver contribute to better vaccine access for poorer nations? So TRIPS, or the Trade-Related Intellectual Property rules, is the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects on intellectual property rights. It's a multilateral pact to protect intellectual property. So the TRIPS Council is a body legally responsible for administering and monitoring the operation of the TRIPS agreement. This is the body that will be meeting this week to deliberate again on the proposal by India and South Africa. So what is it? What would be the impacts of a TRIPS waiver? Firstly, let's go back to what is it that we need. What we need is that at the most immediate, the majority of the world's population will get vaccinated. We want this pandemic to end so that the world achieve herd immunity. Meaning we need COVID-19 vaccines freely available for everyone, everywhere. However, the current capacity, that is the current big pharma controlled capacity, is not enough to inoculate the world's population at the soonest. Firstly, its capacity couldn't deliver to the world's population in time Not a single big pharmaceutical company can deliver what the world needs currently. Second, 80% of the global supply has already been secured by rich countries, while many countries are rushing for more bilateral deals. So waiving intellectual property rules, I'm not even calling it intellectual property rights, it's intellectual property rules and barriers. And enforcing technology transfer could ensure that every qualified manufacturer worldwide is able to make COVID-19 vaccines. This will drive up supply and drive down prices. Combined with increased investment in manufacturing capacity in developing countries, it is the only way to vaccinate the world successfully and sustainably. Yet this move is fiercely opposed by Germany and the UK. As Josh mentioned earlier, even if the Philippines is not publicly blocking the waiver, it's also very silently supporting the waiver. It needs to come out and support the waiver publicly and put pressure on countries like Germany and the UK to stop blocking the waiver. So let me give you a few facts. Number one, over $100 billion in taxpayers' money went into the vaccine science. 97% of the funding, for example, for AstraZeneca, and nearly all the funding for Moderna came from government. Pfizer did not take direct public subsidy, but benefited from billions in pre-orders from the US government, which had the same impact. And their vaccine was developed by BioNTech, a German company that received hundreds of millions in government support. Another fact, there are vaccine manufacturers around the world with capacity to produce vaccines, including in countries in Asia like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, and the obvious ones, of course, in India and China. They have come out and said that they're willing to make hundreds of millions of doses and are ready to do so if intellectual property barriers were removed and the vaccine recipe and know-how shared. Asia and Africa has a sizable generic pharmaceutical industry, which can be deployed to produce vaccines and related technology for itself and the rest of the world. There will be additional long-term benefits of capacity building for the next pandemic. So at ActionAid and the People's Vaccines Alliance, we believe that the following should be done at the most immediate. Number one, we need to seriously commit to the World Health Organization's targets for global vaccine rollout. The WHO called for vaccinating 40% of every country's population by December this year and 70% by the middle of next year. We are woefully behind this. Number two, we need to ensure that vaccine technology and know-how is shared by pharmaceutical companies. We need to shame these behemoths of companies for profiteering from people's lives. As you may have heard, at least 9 people have become new billionaires since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, thanks to excessive profits that pharmaceutical corporations with monopolies on COVID vaccines are making. Number 3, countries like the Philippines need to support the proposal by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive intellectual property restrictions on the production of COVID-19 vaccines and related technologies. Rich country governments, especially Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, are blocking the approval of this TRIPS waiver. That's why countries like the Philippines should come out and publicly support this waiver and publicly call on these countries to stop blocking the approval of the TRIPS waiver, which has been called for by over 100 countries already, and even the US government has said that it supports this proposal. Number 4, invest public funding to increase vaccine research and development and manufacturing capacity around the world. And finally, much has been said about COVID-19 vaccine donations. We're saying that it's supposed to be not donations, it is redistribution. These vaccine doses need to be redistributed and reallocated now. Countries with vaccine oversupply that have already achieved high vaccination coverage must urgently redistribute the COVID-19 vaccines that they are hoarding. We demand transparency and a real timeline to make this happen. There has been so much press about pledges of donation, that this country and that country has pledged to donate this number and that. But what we say is that these donations should have been allocated to developing countries originally. It's not donation, it's redistribution. Every time a rich country leader gets on TV to say that his administration has donated those doses, there are rounds of applause, right? So, but we have fewer than 100 days left until the end of the year. If this redistribution doesn't actually happen, if the TRIPS waiver is not passed at the WTO, the goal of vaccinating 40% of the population in low and middle income countries by the end of 2021 will not be reached. We will not be able to curb this pandemic as soon as possible. So what we are saying as ActionAid and as the People's Vaccine Alliance in Asia and globally, that this is not charity. This is justice and common sense. The TRIPS waiver will need to be passed immediately, and COVID-19 technology and know-how needs to be shared as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Prentispina, for that very informative discussion, and also those very powerful calls for the vaccine technology and other COVID technologies. So thank you to the People's Vaccine Alliance. For our next speaker, we have a discussion on the TRIPS waiver as a legal and economic tool against monopolies. So we have attorney Patricia Santamaria from the Ateneo Law School. Welcome, attorney Santamaria.
Hi, good morning. So thank you for inviting me to speak. So I'd like to thank Dr. Josh, of course, and the coalition for inviting me to speak. And good morning to everyone here. I was invited to speak here because there really are questions about whether the TRIPS waiver is a lawful and a legal remedy we can actually turn to in relation to the problems that COVID-19 and vaccine access has created. So this morning, I'll go through three very broad topics. The first is the question of whether the waiver itself is doable, right? Like, what are the legal processes or mechanisms that come into play when you talk about waiving something like the TRIPS agreement or provisions of the TRIPS agreement? And then second, what does it mean for the Philippines, to decide to support it? Like, what are possibly, as Josh previously mentioned, there are some departments who are maybe a bit hesitant, and what are probably the legal considerations they're taking in determining whether or not to support this waiver? And third, like, what are the consequences, or what could happen if the waiver pushes through, and what does that mean for us as the Philippines, as a developing country, as a country that's suffering gravely from the lack of access to vaccines and other diagnostics? So I guess a background, the questions, can the TRIPS agreement be waived, and or provisions of it can be waived? And the answer is yes, most definitely. The TRIPS agreement is a treaty, and a treaty by definition, it's an agreement between states. And the thing is, this is not actually the first time a TRIPS waiver has been proposed. And the last time was the TRIPS waiver actually happened. So in 2003, there was in fact a TRIPS waiver before, and it involved compulsory licensing. So prior to this waiver, No, when a country was able to use the TRIPS flexibilities for compulsory licensing to kind of create medicines despite patent protection, they were limited to only distributing it in their local, within their own countries. But the TRIPS waiver allowed them, in 2003, allowed them to import them to other countries that did not have manufacturing access. So prior to this movement for a TRIPS waiver initiated by India and South Africa, we actually already had a prior TRIPS waiver. So it definitely can be done, and the WTO has procedures for it. And actually that TRIPS waiver in 2003 went on to become a permanent amendment in 2007, which the Philippines actually agreed to. No? So that waiver, just taking it as an example, it really started, it was an unresolved issue from the 2001 Doha round of the TRIPS. There was a round in Doha to discuss the public health implications of the TRIPS agreement. It started in 2001. The waiver came to be in 2003. So it took roughly 2 years for that waiver to happen, and much longer for it to become eventually a permanent amendment, no? So as for us, we've reached the 1-year mark of this initiative by South Africa and India to waive these TRIPS provisions in light of COVID-19. So we ask ourselves, now, do we have the luxury of time to dilly-dally about whether to legally support the waiver, whether it's a legally possible thing? And from the looks of it, from the numbers we've seen so far, from the figures of deaths and of sick people, no, we don't actually have enough time. So the sooner the better, and it is definitely a legal, possible method. It's definitely something the WTO has done before and something that is possible. But right now, as there is a deadlock and the WTO does vote on consensus, so it's important to put our country's support for the waiver and that we be unequivocal about it. So more countries, more traction in the WTO, which of course functions on consensus, right? So what does it mean to push for the TRIPS waiver in the Philippines? So functionally, it's a matter of foreign relations, which means the ball is in the court of the executive, the president, right? The president is the one who makes the call whether we push for this waiver, because it's a matter of foreign relations. It's a matter of treaty, which is under our law. No, it's a function of the president. So it's up to the executive, the president, and the departments under him. So what is our government likely considering? Josh mentioned it in his presentation. Now, there are other trade agreements which we have entered into, which may be affected by waiving the TRIPS. So we have these free trade agreements, which likely also have provisions on intellectual property protections, but not all of them, if any, should pose significant barriers. So, of course, when we try to push for a TRIPS waiver, it's not just the TRIPS that controls our intellectual property obligations. There are other agreements that the country has entered into that maybe create those obligations independent of the TRIPS. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they pose significant barriers or are legal barriers to us supporting the TRIPS, the TRIPS waiver, sorry. So for example, the trade agreement we have with Japan, the JPEPA, it heavily references the TRIPS agreement. So it doesn't necessarily pose a different barrier to intellectual property waivers. The agreement we have with, it's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement that also includes Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and other countries. It's very explicit, that if between these two agreements, it's the TRIPS agreement that will take precedence, and that you don't use this agreement to impede public health. So while it's a valid concern for the government to say that, there are other agreements we have to kind of consider before we support this TRIPS waiver, a look into these agreements will show that not necessarily all of them actually pose substantive barriers to, at least, at the very least, putting our pull behind the TRIPS waiver. But aside from the legalities, these FTAs, these free trade agreements also represent economic relations. So there probably were certain compromises or certain provisions that we don't necessarily know about, and the executive obviously has to take those into account. Currently, or at least the talks between the EU, for example, and the Philippines for our own free trade agreement with the EU stalled in 2017. So it is possible that maybe there are actually free trade agreements on the table that are being negotiated, and the government could possibly be sort of weighing the effect supporting the TRIPS waiver could have on free trade agreements that are also currently being negotiated. But even given all that, when we talk about what exactly our government should consider, whether it's free trade agreements with other countries or whether it's our own domestic intellectual property laws, what should be considered above any and all property rights and relations is obviously a right to health and a right to life. Lalo na we are in a pandemic, there is no signs that it will be over soon. Right, so both in normal times and in a pandemic, number one consideration really should be your capacity to take care of your people and to save our lives. And right now, vaccines and other diagnostic and therapeutic technology can do that. We've said, there's an accepted principle or in the law, that your right to life, at least as far as the Philippines is concerned, it's not just the right to life, it's your right to a good life. In the words of the late Father Bernas. So it's a right to health, it's a right to be safe and secure. And in law, there is a hierarchy of rights, meaning it has always been life, over property and over all these economic considerations. So even if it's valid for the governments of the world, of the Philippines, to consider economic relations, intellectual property, and all these other things when deciding whether to support the TRIPS waiver, it has always been life over property, and that should be ideally the number one consideration of any government, of ours most certainly. So what happens now? What happens if and hopefully when a TRIPS waiver is agreed upon? We may need to renegotiate some free trade agreements or make adjustments to our own laws depending on the extent and duration of the waiver. So right now, the proposed one is 3 years, but we don't know exactly what we'll end up with after these rounds of talks this week. So the waiver puts power back into the hands of the people and actually pushes governments towards working for the public interest. As the previous speaker mentioned, a lot of the vaccines were developed with public money, right? With public funding, with government advanced orders or research grants. So for a long time, actually, when you talk about whose interest is it in keeping protections over vaccine technology, it's primarily pharmaceutical companies, right? And despite, again, public money funding them, a waiver would help the government, or push the governments actually, to walk the talk of making vaccines accessible through means of production and not just available through donations. We are obviously very grateful for any vaccines that come our way, but looking at the bigger picture, donations are a very poor substitute, for equitable access and for health justice, right? Because donations are, they're still in the control of people or of countries or interests that are free to prioritize profit whenever they want it, right? So a waiver would ideally liberalize both manufacturing and distribution. So what do you mean when you say we want to waive the TRIPS agreement? The TRIPS agreement establishes obligations, so duties on the part of a country to protect intellectual property in a certain way, right? Or up to a certain threshold. And waiving the TRIPS agreement or provisions of it in relation to COVID would free the countries to suspend those protections on the relevant technology. So a waiver would ideally do three things. It increases the supply of vaccines, of diagnostics, of the relevant therapeutics for COVID-19. It facilitates access, and this is important because right now it's not just about supply, like whether we can get our hands on the vaccines, but whether that supply doesn't necessarily just exist, but whether we can access it, right? Whether the technology is also transferred, whether the prices are low enough. So it increases supply, facilitates access, and brings down the price. Very important, especially for developing countries like us. Okay, but know that waiver is only really the first step. It lifts restrictions and rules that would have functioned as obstacles, but we have to position ourselves to take advantage of those. A waiver of the TRIPS provision will be very difficult to obtain, but if and hopefully when we do obtain it, that's kind of not the end of our struggle, no, for treating the country of COVID-19. The government needs to focus on one, if not both things the waiver is likely to make more possible, either manufacture or importation, right? Because it's not enough that these provisions or protections are waived. Their effects, we have to take advantage of them. So we have to address the bottlenecks that currently exist in our purchasing systems or in our supply and distribution. Like right now, there is not just inequity within countries, not just an inequity inside our country, with provinces getting very little vaccine supply. So we have to fix those, because a waiver would be pointless if we also do not fix the systems that are set up to take advantage of the waiver if and when it does happen. So we have to address the bottlenecks and work on our capacity for storage, for vaccination, and for distribution. And we have to create the infrastructure and regulatory framework needed to best take advantage of the waiver. So in conclusion, no, there is value in putting our weight as a country behind the waiver, because above all, it serves the right to life and health of the people, and that really should be our number one priority. And that's not just some moralizing like slogan, right? Like we have to put life above everything else. But in our law, there is a dictate that you put life and health over proprietary or property rights. And this pandemic is essentially a very long game, and we should be prepared for what comes after the waiver, if and when we do get it, right? So it's not just leaving the waiver. It's not just moving for the waiver and then leaving the bigger countries, the big pharma companies to come save us. And we have to create the own frameworks and structures and infrastructure that will help us take advantage of that waiver. So thank you again for inviting me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Santa Maria, for that very enlightening perspective on the legal aspects of the TRIPS waiver. So for our next speaker, who will discuss on the TRIPS waiver as a people's movement against profit and monopolies, we have Mr. Ruben Casalda from the Secretariat of the People Over Profit. He is also the program officer of the Asia Pacific Research Network. So welcome, Robin.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for the three speakers for their wonderful discussion. I will read the statement of the People Over Profit regarding on the TRIPS waiver. The campaign initiators of People Over Profits supports the people's movement in the Philippines seeking to achieve a waiver on the TRIPS for the COVID-19 vaccine. There are more than 100 countries who have supported the proposal of India and South Africa to waive the WTO TRIPS on the vaccine. We are one of the groups based in the Philippines in ending vaccine monopoly of the few big pharmaceutical companies. People Over Profit is a workers-led global campaign platform that unites working people's social movement and non-government organizations across the globe against corporate greed, corporate plunder, and to demand the people over profit, fighting against imperial hegemony of transnational corporations on the daily lives of the working people. We believe that the provisions of healthcare is a public responsibility and vaccines are public goods. Our healthcare system must serve the interests and needs of the people, including the provision of vaccines to all free of charge. The COVID-19 vaccines and the access to it has become an issue of survival for the society and the working peoples. We seek to end the control of transnational corporations on the vaccine and the pandemic. The vaccines are public good and private interests and profits must not dictate the pandemic response. We seek an end to the vaccine patents under the WTO TRIPS. We support the moves to waive the vaccine patents and allow countries to manufacture their own vaccines without any patent payments to the transnational corporations. We demand countries establish robust healthcare system, invest in public healthcare by building new hospitals and hiring health workers, building infrastructures, allowing them to manufacture their own vaccines for needs of the people. We are very concerned with the pandemic and its impact to the working people. The World Health Organization reports that global cases of infection have surpassed the 238 million, and global deaths from the new coronavirus are more than 4.8 million. Over 3.5 million of the deaths have been in Americas and Europe. Many countries are experiencing a fourth surge of the pandemic, with the rate of infection out of control and health system overwhelmed. We are very concerned with the rising unemployment, reaching more than 255 million jobs lost during pandemic, almost 5 times the number of jobs lost during the 2008 global economic crisis. Workers are suffering from wage cuts, unemployment, indebtedness, homelessness, lack of access to social services, and rising cost of living. We are very concerned with the rising public debt incurred by governments to fight the pandemic. To offset the pandemic's economic toll, the global debt reached an all-time high of 281 trillion US dollars by the end of 2020, or more than 355% of the global GDP. In order to repay their debts, capitalists will focus on breakneck extraction of super profits through austerity measures. Anti-worker policies such as race to the bottom wages, flexible labor arrangements, and new consumption taxes will be intensified, especially in the global south. We are appalled by the continued profit-making of transnational corporations despite the loss the world is experiencing. Pfizer has made 3.5 billion US dollars in revenues for the first quarter of 2021 and has admitted that the COVID-19 vaccine is the biggest source of revenue. Pfizer vaccine partner BioNTech has reported a 11.8 billion US dollar revenue from the vaccine. Pfizer is predicting that it will generate 33.5 billion US dollar in revenue for 2021, more than 300% increase compared to its registered 9.9 billion US dollars in profits in 2020. Aside from the big pharmaceutical from the Western countries, the Chinese and Indian suppliers are also raking in billion in profits. The development of the vaccine by the different pharmaceutical companies are funded by the people's money. BioNTech received 445 million US dollars from the German taxpayers, while Moderna got 438 million US dollars from American taxpayers. We are appalled at the governments and international trade platforms like the World Trade Organization, who are enablers of the profiteering of the big pharmaceutical corporations. Under the WTO trade-related aspect of intellectual property, or TRIPS, agreement, no one can make the COVID-19 vaccines unless they have the intellectual property rights. We are appalled at the vaccine inequity, which countries already have twice or even greater the number of vaccines compared to their population. The rich countries have corralled 87% of the 700 million doses of available vaccines, while the poor countries a mere 0.2%. Neoliberal globalization has left the public healthcare system of countries in a state of neglect due to privatization and austerity measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing those staggering amounts of profits from the vaccines alone. No, not yet included are the profits for the medications, the medicines, and other technologies. So thank you. And now to give us a synthesis and call to action, we have again Dr. Joshua San Pedro of the Coalition for People's Right to Health. Josh?
Hi, ma'am. Sorry, could we hear muna from our reactors for now?
Oh, okay.
Right.
Sorry. So for our reactors and also for those who have sent messages and statements. So for our reactors, we have Mr. Lakan Umali, a graduate student from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and a COVID-19 survivor. So Lakan, can we hear from you?
Hello po, Ma'am Len. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I forgot that I had this background. Hello po, Ma'am Len. Thank you to the CPRH for inviting me to react to today's discussion. I found it very fruitful and enlightening on the necessity of the TRIPS waiver and the different mechanisms that are possible to ensure vaccine equity all over the world, and the solidarity we have to show in different countries like India and South Africa to really ensure that the vaccine inequality has ends once and for all, and that the world manages to actually move on, or at least manage COVID-19 without causing more needless suffering to the global south and third world countries. I recently, at the end of August, all of the members of our household got infected with COVID. 5 out of 5 of us got infected, and then we live next to our grandfather and our uncle, and they were also infected. My grandfather was 88 years old, and for the majority of the pandemic, he was fine, but it was only recently, after 500 days of almost ceaseless lockdown, where he was infected, which speaks of what I see as the failure of managing and isolating this pandemic. None of us had gone out in the past 5 months. The only times when anyone in our household would go out was to go to the bank or for necessary errands. We would have our groceries delivered. We would just lock ourselves in. I would just go out to walk my dog sometimes around our block. I would have my face mask. I wouldn't interact with anyone in the open air. But we were all still somehow infected, and we don't know where it had come from. It could have come from a delivery person. It could have come from a visit to the bank. But the point is that no matter how careful we were all infected. And even I'm very grateful that my parents were fully vaccinated because they were also seniors. They were fully vaccinated. However, my father developed severe COVID. Thankfully, he was on home care and oxygen, and he managed to recover. We weren't able to find a free hospital room, but we were able to find private care. And our experience with COVID really reaffirmed the fact that it's awful to get COVID, especially in a country like the Philippines. The Philippines really is one of the worst countries in the world to get COVID. We're distinctly middle class, but the cost of hiring a private nurse and the cost of healthcare, of managing a family member with COVID were absolutely exorbitant. I can't imagine how much more difficult it is if you're from the working class, if you're making minimum wage, and then suddenly one of your family members or loved ones gets COVID. I don't know how they'd be able to manage with that. And not just that, but even the other factors that exacerbate the transmission and severity of COVID in our country. We're lucky that we have a house we're capable of physically isolating with one another. We're lucky that we live in a place where we can socially distance with one another, where we can eat at a table and stay 6 feet away from each other. However, that's not a privilege that most Filipinos have, since so many Filipinos live in cramped, informal settlements as a result of years of unequal, as a result of years of the lack of accessible public housing and the exorbitant cost of living in an area like Metro Manila. I can also imagine what it must be like to live in a place in the Philippines that's outside of the urban center, where we live in San Juan City in Metro Manila, and our local government has so far done an adequate job of procuring vaccines for its citizens. However, it's still taken months for the majority of San Juan City to be vaccinated. And we're one of the smallest cities in the country. So I can imagine how much more difficult it is for smaller LGUs without the money or the resources to be able to acquire and distribute vaccines to their constituents. And in the past few months, I think that there's the popular idea that COVID is something that we have to live with for the rest of our lives. It's something echoed by lawmakers, that we have to live with COVID and that we have to learn to live in the new normal. However, the discussion today highlighted the fact that there are mechanisms, there are campaigns, there are movements which the Philippines can throw their weight behind, such as the campaign to waive, such as the campaign for the TRIPS Waiver, which would work towards really not just forcing the majority of people to continue living with the risk of acquiring the virus, but to ensure that the majority of people, the Filipinos, and not just Filipinos, but the majority of people who live in the third world and other poorer countries do have access to vaccines. They do have access to life-saving health mechanisms and tools. Attorney Pat, before, she said that it wasn't just when we talk about how life should be over profit, it's not just a moralizing slogan. It's something which is starkly necessary, especially in our time right now, because these political decisions of governments like the UK and Germany to block the TRIPS waiver, these aren't just political decisions, but they have the direct effect on the lives of people, not just within their own borders, but on the lives of millions and millions of people who live outside the borders of these rich countries. Citizens who do not make these decisions, but are still affected by the decisions that these people in power make. So I'm thankful to CPRH and the other organizations here for their continuous fight for the TRIPS waiver and for ensuring vaccine equity, so that more people don't suffer, and so that all of this suffering can be avoided and can come to an end. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Lacan, for your sharing about your experience and also your insights into the overall situation regarding the COVID pandemic. So for our next reactor, we have Mary Zubiri, a humanitarian logistician from Médecins Sans Frontières, and she is based in Juba in South Sudan. So welcome, Mary's. Have you on board?
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this really important discussion. So from my side, I'm a humanitarian worker for MSF, and I've had the opportunity to see specifically directly with my own eyes the state of healthcare in remote areas in Africa. Prior to Juba, I was in Nigeria, in Maiduguri, and it's very much like the Philippines. You could see the vast inequality of access to healthcare, as well as the difference of quality in itself. So if you go to the capital, you would see your own private hospitals. They have their own COVID testing centers, their own vaccination or sometimes COVID tracing facilities. But once you go, let's say 1 hour away, 2 hours away, it's completely a different story. Even getting there is very difficult. You would only have limited planes from select humanitarian agencies. So it's not really possible to get there. And so imagine the implications of that to the healthcare itself. You would see that there's only one hospital for a specific, let's say, for maternity ward or for pediatrics. And that hospital is not really at the best state. They only have limited equipment, limited doctors, limited health practitioners, and virtually, for example, you'll see a hospital with no ICU. And of course, it cannot treat all the other cases aside from those that it specializes on. So it's really very difficult. And once you exacerbate or you add insult to the injury by adding these COVID problems, it really becomes imaginable. And it's not just, let's say, a question of financial, because even if you get those donations, but if you get them, let's say, on a based on depending or dependent mechanisms, such as you're just depending on the donation of these COVID alliance or these high income countries, then from the other side, it creates another problem because you cannot really plan. It creates a rupture. So even, for example, now in Juba, previously they have their own supply, but just after 2 weeks, it it's completely gone, and no one knows where the next supply is, and that creates a sense of uncertainty, and also like people don't know, okay, what will happen next, and would we get our next vaccine? Would we get our second dose? And people cannot plan, and it creates ruptures in the supply chain system, which then creates another set of problems. And even if humanitarian organizations such as MSF try to contribute and try to help as much, it's not really the most sustainable way. We need more. We need the TRIPS waiver, because even such as access to, let's say, gloves, to masks, it's really very difficult. Even if you have the money to buy those, importing them into the country is another different story. So of course, prevention is always better than cure, and vaccination is always, let's say, the first and foremost priority. COVID, the Gavi Alliance previously committed like 1 billion doses by the end of 2021, but we know by now, as of September 2021, that we're nowhere near there. They just already gave 230 million doses, and at the same time, pharmaceutical companies are benefiting from it. It's really high time. There's no time to waste, because this is just a recurring problem. And I think the TRIPS, and even as an organization, MSF is constantly pushing for for those countries not to block the TRIPS waiver. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you for your sharing, Maris. So we have someone from Dr. Delen de la Paz from People's Health Movement, Philippines. You would like to say something about the waiver? PHM International is one of the very active proponents of the waiver. Dr.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Len, and everybody in this forum. It has really been very enlightening. Thank you, Josh, for the introduction on what's happening in the Philippines. So the People's Health Movement is a global movement of individuals, organizations, from community-based groups and academic institutions, and even also government people working in government who have been in the forefront since 2000 in calling for the upholding of the people's right to health. So the People's Charter for Health has actually enumerated all this. And one of the issues we have been raising since then was the issue of TRIPS. Why is medicines, which is a vital component of life, being included in the trade issue of trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights? Health should not be a trade issue. It is a rights issue, and we look at this in terms of service to the people and not for profit. So I appreciate all the previous presentations that really highlighted all these points. Now, for the issue of the TRIPS waiver, the PHM has submitted several position papers to WTO and in fact also to WHO, asking that WHO already make a clear and strong statement to WTO and push for the TRIPS waiver to happen. But of course, WHO, considering it's also saying that they respect WTO as a collegial body, is not able to do it yet. But we really want a strong statement from WHO to really push for the TRIPS waiver. And recently, PHM held a forum, a webinar also, together with Third World Network, where the issue of diagnostics and therapeutics were also highlighted. That it's not just a matter of vaccines that should be looked into in terms of TRIPS waiver, but also the therapeutics and the diagnostics, because they all come together. Like for instance, now we're using tocilizumab, which is very expensive. We're using remdesivir, which is also very expensive. And these are all covered by patent protection of the companies. That's why it's very expensive. So this should also be lowered down, like molnupiravir, which is a new drug developed by Merck, has also come out, which is again very expensive. So we're also appealing to the scientists and the producers to share the knowledge that what we are developing here is something that is important to life. And this is really a new development. You do not know what's happening next as an impact of the virus. So all effort should be put into scientific research, but the scientists and the pharmaceutical companies should engage in knowledge sharing of this initiative. So it's not simply to make profit out of it. Like as mentioned earlier, also there are already so many billionaires that have been identified from the time the pandemic has started because they're earning from it. And so therefore, this is something that we should continue to push for. So PHM supports the TRIPS waiver for the vaccines, but at the same time also supports a TRIPS waiver for diagnostics and therapeutics, because together we can only address this pandemic if this will be all addressed. So we thank you for this forum, and PHM Global as well as PHM Philippines is with all of us in this endeavor for a TRIPS waiver to include also diagnostics and therapeutics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delen, for the input on what's happening globally with the People's Health Movement. We also have a statement from the Cure COVID Alliance to be read by Rain Sindayan. So Rain, thank you for being on board. The Cure COVID Alliance is also one of the very active groups in terms of discussing what's happening regarding our COVID response. So we'd like to hear from them. They're also part of our co-sponsors for this event. So thank you, Ray. So,
Hi, magandang umaga sa lahat ng mga kasamahan natin dito. Good morning. We are from the Cure COVID Network or the... Okay, I think I was muted a bit. Hi, magandang umaga sa lahat ng kasama natin dito. Maraming salamat sa pag-iimbita sa amin na maging bahagi ng programang ito. We are the Citizens Urgent Response to End COVID-19 or Cure COVID. We've been established since the early days of the pandemic around March, and then we've been calling for equitable, safe, humane, and participatory response to the COVID-19 crisis, something that this particular administration is sorely lacking. So dun naman po sa usapin ng TRIPS Waiver, so we've prepared a statement for this, and allow me to read this particular statement for today. So again, good morning to everyone. So in light of the people's struggle for just and equitable healthcare, we at the Citizens Urgent Response to End COVID-19 or Cure COVID call on the Philippine government to formally support the waiver from certain provisions of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights or TRIPS agreement for the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19, proposed by South Africa and India and co-sponsored by at least 60 countries. A temporary patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines, drugs, and related technologies under the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement would reduce barriers to the broader production and delivery of life-saving vaccines and treatments and help save countless lives. It could reduce disparities in global vaccination rates and address inequities that leave behind billions of people worldwide. The TRIPS waiver is necessary, particularly in the Philippines, where the bungled management of the pandemic and decrepit state of healthcare have resulted in tens of thousands of COVID-19 deaths. Despite the clamor for faster vaccination, mass testing, contact tracing, and other scientifically sound responses to a medical and social crisis, the Duterte administration continues to neglect health and instead concentrates on the repression of rights and freedoms. We must hold accountable regimes and enterprises that would willfully deprive the most vulnerable of life-saving vaccines and drugs in the name of profit. Our demand for the TRIPS waiver is a step to securing the welfare of millions of Filipinos. We also call on the medical and scientific communities to join the masses in pressuring the Philippine government to unequivocally endorse the TRIPS waiver. And that's the end of our statement. That's our statement on the TRIPS waiver.
thank you for that, Robert, for your calls also regarding the TRIPS waiver. We hope that we will be heard by the authorities regarding these statements in our calls. So to give us a synthesis of what's been discussed for this morning, we call on our convener for the Coalition for People's Right to Health, Dr. Josh San Pedro.
All right, thank you very much again, Dr. Len, and to all of our speakers, our esteemed speakers for today, and our reactors. So again, I'd like to thank our organizers and our partners for this press and public briefing: the Coalition for People's Right to Health, Bantay Bakuna, Council for Health and Development, the People's Health Movement Philippines, the People's Vaccine Alliance Asia, Cure COVID, or the Citizens Urgent Response to End COVID-19, as well as our media partners, Now You Know and Raptor Move PH. So thank you to our speakers earlier, to Ma'am Dinah, to Attorney Patty, and Sir Robin, and as well as to our reactors. Okay, so just to summarize, and before we go to our open forum, just to synthesize what we have heard today. So it's basically our discussion today is how basically can the TRIPS waiver help the Philippines? Now, what can it do? What are the aspects of it that can help really change our COVID-19 response? And we can see that the TRIPS waiver as a whole helps ensure the right to health. It is a global solidarity for equity. Now, it's not just about it's not just about ensuring the vaccines. That's something that global solidarity is really needed for a global health problem, especially that it's not something that only the rich countries can achieve alone. It's not something that the developing countries can achieve, given how bad the COVID-19 pandemic has hit them. And there really must be global cooperation. There really must be equitable distribution, not donation. Again, as mentioned by Ma'am Dinah earlier, that it is depending a lot on redistribution of the COVID-19 technologies, including the vaccines that were really funded by public. And Attorney Patty mentioned how this is all legal. No, the TRIPS waiver in itself is not new. No, there, despite the TRIPS flexibilities after the Doha Declaration, this is just another response. No, albeit probably more sweeping and more far-reaching than the those declared in the early 2000s. But this is something that is legal. No? This is not illegal. This is something that we are seeing because of the value, no, of life, the value of health, and the right to health over so many other matters such as profit, so many other matters such as monopolies. This is definitely a way to break those monopolies on a legal basis through this TRIPS waiver. And lastly, Sir Robin mentioned, that it's really, there's a need, for a larger people's movement to struggle against profits, to struggle against these transnational corporations who are hoarding, these life-saving technologies, these very important resources that must belong to the people and must ensure the people's health during this time. And all our reactors were able to show what is the importance of having equitable access of all communities, especially those in far-flung areas, especially those in disadvantaged and isolated areas, especially those in marginalized communities. That we really need equitable access, not just to vaccines, but to diagnostics, medicines, vaccines, and technologies that will help us prevent, treat, and contain the COVID-19 pandemic. We see that the Philippines continues to struggle. It's one of the worst places to be in during this pandemic, and thus we call on the Philippine government, as well as many other countries, to support the TRIPS waiver, to put health back in the hands of the people, by putting these diagnostics, these medicines, these vaccines, and technologies not under mere jurisdiction of intellectual property rules, not rights, of only transnational corporations and those seen by the World Trade Organization, but again, putting health back in the hands of the people as their right to health during such a major public health emergency of international concern. And thus, we call on the Philippine government to support the TRIPS waiver now, as soon as possible, because it is already more than a year since the TRIPS waiver was passed, and we really have to commit to really push on the right to health, and we all have a role in that, in ensuring that the government supports the TRIPS waiver and the larger goal of health equity, and not just vaccine equity. So to end, before we go to our open forum, CPRH is also doing some campaigns for the rest of the week moving forward. And these are the following. Again, in pushing for the TRIPS waiver now, we will be writing again an open letter to our World Trade Organization representative, Ambassador Manuel Tihanki. We already wrote a letter back in June, and we will be writing again, and we invite our speakers, we invite our audience, and we invite everyone to co-sign our open letter to our trade representative, as well as other trade officials who continue to be reluctant and continue to waiver on this very important waiver. And we will be continuing our Twitter rallies leading up to our October 13 TRIPS Council meeting. And we invite again everyone to our mobilization on Wednesday, October 13, 2021. Before the Geneva meeting, we invite everyone to join a mobilization at the Department of Trade and Industry for us to call that the Philippines stop wavering on the waiver, to support the TRIPS waiver now, and to put people over patents, people over profit, and realize that the right to health during this pandemic that has been debilitating, that has caused immeasurable suffering for so many Filipinos. So with that, thank you very much for attending this forum and this press con and public briefing. And we will now go to our open forum. Thank you very much.
So thank you for that concise summary and the sharp calls for the waiver of the TRIPS. So we are now the forum is now open for your questions. If we have questions from our friends from the media, from Mr. Makalala, is he still around, and our friends from GMA? From our Facebook comments, we have from Mr. Rafael Montes from Australia, who said that countries must develop their own vaccine technology to achieve self-reliance. And from Mel Garcia of the Health Alliance for Democracy, there's a call to support the TRIPS waiver and to expose all efforts to block the passage of the waiver by big pharma firms. We demand that the Philippine government support the TRIPS waiver. So that's from Health Alliance for Democracy. So we have also questions or comments from our participants. Okay. Any last words from our speakers?
Dr. N, could I ask a question to some of our remaining
Yes,
speakers?
sure.
I think Ma'am Dinah had to leave because of some concerns. But I just want to ask the remaining speakers, especially Attorney Patty. One thing that was mentioned earlier in one of the questions, one of the comments, was that we really need to produce our own vaccines to be self-reliant, and that was something we saw in other countries like Cuba, who was able to really to produce its own vaccines despite there being an embargo on them. So I just want to ask, especially with the Philippines, I mentioned that we already have the most number of vaccines approved in the world. Do you think this says a lot with our lack of vaccine production? And do you think legally we should be able to also safeguard local industries by passing an enabling law, maybe if ever the TRIPS waiver does get approved by the World Trade Organization? Is that something that we should look into, apart from what was mentioned, that we help fund these organizations, these companies locally? Do we need legal protection for them to not be sued eventually in the future? Because just to add, you mentioned that there were TRIPS flexibilities that were done in the early 2000s, but despite that, despite some attempts by Canada, by South Africa to do compulsory licensing, eventually they were countersued, or those who were trying to do parallel importation did face some legal challenges from the companies who were forced to be to give away the compulsory license. So in this regard, should there be legal protection, so a law after the TRIPS waiver is signed to encourage local production?
Okay, so I think I can start off with that. So I think the Philippines for the longest time hasn't had really sufficient manufacturing capacity for its population, not only for vaccines but also for pharmaceuticals in general, which is why we have these laws about parallel importation. We have the Cheaper Medicines Act and the Generic Drugs Law, because for the longest time, and I'm not quite up to date up to the figures, but for the longest time, aside from Japan, we had the highest drug rates drug prices in the region because we didn't have any local manufacturing capacity and we depended solely on imports. Definitely, I think we need, we would, if we were to opt that manufacturing capacity, we would need incentives, possibly through laws. And on that end, as it is now, our intellectual property code does allow for compulsory licensing during national emergency, right? And I'm sure the COVID-19 pandemic does qualify as a national emergency, although we really haven't seen that particular provision invoked a lot, which is why really the waiver isn't the end, for our government. We, in choosing to support the waiver, we also have to think about what we want to do post waiver. Do we want to take advantage of building our own manufacturing capacity? And I know they recently, I think, started construction or the infrastructure for a serum institute or a vaccine institute. So we used to have one, but then it got defunded, but now they're trying to. Or do we take advantage of the increased opportunities for importation, which may be the more pragmatic solution right now, immediately? So it's definitely something for the long run, but we do need to study. If we want immediate access to vaccines, we do need to study probably more on the importation side. So definitely we do have to up our manufacturing capacity for the population because it is a recurring problem, not just for the COVID-19 pandemic, but for pharmaceuticals in general, which is why malakasan yung monopoly of pharmaceutical products here kasi hindi nga tayo masyadong nag-manufacture dito, and it's not as liberal, it's not as, it's not as equal. There's really a concentration, it's not as equally distributed as probably other industries. So a loss would definitely help. We do have current provisions in our intellectual property code that could be used, but more laws incentivizing manufacturing capacity would probably help.
Thank you for that reply, Councillor Pat. So are there any other questions? Oh, we have a question here from the chat on Facebook for our speakers. What is the attitude of the present Philippine government on the TRIPS waiver? Maybe we can reiterate that. Can we expect a favorable response from the present leadership? Or do we have to wait for a change of government that is responsive to people's right to health and welfare? So from our speakers.
Right. So
the first part, sure.
Okay, so as we can see, I think there were a lot of differing opinions from the different agencies. Again, so far, if we were to plot it, those who are supportive, we can see that in some legislative officials, some in Congress, some in the Senate, the DOH, through those who represented us at the World Health Assembly, were supportive for the TRIPS waiver. Secretary Locsin and Secretary of the DFA and Secretary Roque of the Presidential Spokesperson's Office both have made statements saying that we would support the TRIPS waiver, but given the statements from the Department of Trade and Industry, the Intellectual Property Office, who are very reluctant to support it because of, as mentioned earlier, some legal challenges, preferences that we use TRIPS flexibilities instead so that we don't affect our trade relations. That seems to be the position of these individuals, and that's worrying because, of course, the Department of Trade and Industry serves as our trade minister and who directly interacts with our World Trade Organization permanent representative, Ambassador Tihanki. So despite the pronouncements of the DOH, DFA, presidential spokesperson, the overwhelming opinion of the DTI and IPO is concerning. I just want to also raise one congressional inquiry done during the budget hearing of the DFA, in which Congresswoman Sara Ilago posed a question to the DFA on what is the status really of the TRIPS waiver. And the DFA official responded to the congressional inquiry, saying that a technical committee on WTO matters has been formed, and yet they're only still just studying, the proposal of the South Africa and India and the other countries, as well as the European Union counter proposal, which is basically espousing just the TRIPS flexibilities or pretty much the status quo. So because of this, we haven't really heard categorically. And again, we haven't heard the President Duterte speak about it. Secretary Duque even mention it, or even Secretary Galvez or anyone in the IETF or NTF even remotely mention the TRIPS waiver, and that is very concerning. That reflects how seriously they take the issue. So I'd also want to refer this to Attorney Patty. If you could also comment on where does this leave us if this if we have this seeming deadlock as well in our in our government position. Is the DTI position really going to be the more overwhelming opinion compared to the others?
So I really can't comment on how exactly what the state is, but because the TRIPS is a treaty, it's a foreign relations matter. Our sole, the legal terminology, is our sole instrument for foreign relations is the president, and it is the president's call. And everyone, whether it's the DFA, the DTI, all follow from the president's discretion as to how we are to relate in foreign relations. So because it's a treaty, it's up to the president. And from the looks of it, it seems as there's probably been a directive for different departments to study it, but really moving it along is the ball is in the president's court. So it's not like DTI will have a say over DFA, for example. It's really all it's in the sole power of the president. So I would wait on that if at all.
Councillor Pat. So there is another question from our Facebook friends, from Mr. Benjamin David. I recently read that Lagundi and BCO technology has been produced locally as protection for COVID. How can we pressure the government to develop our own technology so that we may not be victims of these multinational corporations? So someone from our speakers can answer that.
Sige, if anyone else will be willing to answer. Pero in the meantime, I agree, definitely local industry is really a big player really, in very important for our COVID-19 response. We cannot just be relying so much. We saw what happens if this country becomes reliant on imports, becomes reliant on having to do questionable deals with foreign countries just to get items and medicines and technologies that are not locally available, or whether that may be a real reason or not. But there are so many concerns with a country not being able to produce its own medicines, its own treatments, its own diagnostics, and its own technologies. So definitely it's high time for the Philippines to really invest in healthcare, in ensuring not just our access to healthcare, but also part of that ensuring that access is being able to manufacture our own goods, our own products, which is also those produced with our own studies. So there are studies with VCO, our studies with Lagundi definitely can help in increasing local production, local access to these essential medications that can help in this pandemic. But ultimately, we can also seek our own abilities to be able to produce our own COVID-19 tests, to produce our own COVID-19 technologies, to produce our own COVID-19 vaccines in the future, and or even such things for any other disease in the future. So that's definitely one thing that we have to do, and one thing that enables us to increase really our local manufacturing capabilities, are ensuring the access to ultra low freezers, ensuring our access to medications that will really cure COVID-19 and even improve our research will depend on the loosening of intellectual property rules, no, in removing the aspect of trade aspects when we look at health as a right, no, instead of something to be profited on. But if our other speakers can also comment.
Maybe,
May I add? May I add? This is Delen.
yes, yes, I was going to call on Dr. Delen for sharing what are other countries in the PHM have experienced regarding this.
First, for the Philippines, we have to have a change of framework kasi yung economic policies natin ay nakabatay talaga sa globalization, which is WTO directed. So, pumasok tayo sa WTO kasi natakot tayo mapag-iwanan ng development. Pero ang nangyari, nilamon tayo ng development ng first world countries. And we are very much attuned to this framework. So yun yung dapat na baguhin. Yung mindset that we can do this, that we need to give more budgets for this. Hindi pwedeng sabihin lang natin na, sige, mag-develop tayo, but where is the budget for that? Dapat bigyan ng supporting budgets ng gobyerno yung science and technology aspects ng ating lipunan. So, pati yung pagbibigay suporta din sa mga grupo kagaya ng FDA. Napakaliit na mga budget ng mga yan. Kaya paano mo maaasahan na uunlad yung kanilang mga researches kung hindi rin susuportahan ng national government. So this is where we need to push that the government should stop being subservient to WTO dictates kasi diyan pumapasok yung TRIPS natatakot silang banggain ang international norm. So dito dapat manindigan ang Pilipinas na yung national ang priority over foreign products. But this really needs a big push kasi ngayon ang economic policies natin ay nakabatay sa international WTO standards, international WTO agreements, and our government is very much afraid to go against it. So dapat basagin yun. And I'd like to share that in other countries globally, nagagawa nila yan. Like as mentioned earlier, Cuba is able to do it despite the sanctions that have been imposed on it. They're able to develop their own pharma industry because of their own resolve to maximize their local resources, and they train their scientists and medical personnel for the interest of the country. Sa atin, ang training natin is napaka-colonial oriented. Kaya yung graduates natin, scientists natin, where do they go? They go abroad because there's no support locally. And in other countries also like Thailand, they're able to develop their own industry. Bangladesh was able to produce its own drug manufacturing unit, a very small country, but with the support of their local scientists, they were able to do it. So I think it can be done. It's just the Philippine government has to change its economic direction in terms of policies that are very subservient to WTO and globalization policies. Thank you. Muted ka, Len. Len, you're on mute.
Thank you for that, Dr. Delen. Councillor Pat may want to say a few words about that. Do we need a law for this?
Yeah, I just also wanted to add, whether it's local or domestic research on your VCO or your Lagundi or on those natural remedies, so to speak, or your drugs, your pharmaceutical drugs. We really need more incentives for research because the reason or a big justification that's being pushed really by your Western countries and your pharma corporations for intellectual property protections, which the TRIPS is, which WTO is, it's really because it allegedly incentivizes innovation. When we know from other experiences that that's not necessarily true, or IP is not the only way you can actually incentivize innovation. So if you have, for example, government subsidies or research grants that can actually take the place of what IP supposedly incentivizes, then you will have a better environment for the development of these for these technologies and these products in the Philippines, and you don't drive our scientists away. So I agree, there really needs to be more support for scientific research. There really needs to be more state-driven incentives so we don't rely on intellectual property so much. That's all.
Thank you for that, Councilor Patty. So our Josh, you have additional comments?
Yeah, that's fine for me. I agree wholly with what Patty said, that we really need to shift maybe from not just wholly relying on intellectual property. And I think that's also one reason why a lot of our scientists are a little also worried about supporting the TRIPS waiver, as they may think that we might eventually remove even their own intellectual property rights locally. But that's not our point here. Our point here is, of course, with the transnational corporations. So we want local scientists, we want local industry to benefit from the removal of these intellectual property rights from or intellectual property rules from those monopolizing our COVID-19 response.
Thank you, Josh. So we're actually running out of time. Any takeaway from our speakers before we close our session for this morning?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate that this is really a people's action. Kaya maganda yung ginagawa ng Coalition for the People's Right to Health, mobilizing communities. First of all, of course, educating them, making them understand that we can do this, kaya natin to, and then mobilizing them to really demand for our just rights. So hindi to mangyayari kung walang people's push. Kaya yung push ng mga tao, yung people's movement, dapat mahalagang ipagpatuloy natin. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Delen. Thank you. So anyone else? Robert? Or so kung wala na, you want to say something, Josh?
Just want to reiterate na lang ko before we finish. Again, our campaigns in the coming days. That we are again doing additional campaigns moving forward. Again, to co-sign our open letter to trade officials, and to continue our Twitter rally in the next few days, and our mobilization this coming Wednesday, to demand really support for the TRIPS waiver now from trade officials. Especially as they are the ones who are most likely to waiver on this waiver, that we call on again more popular support, more public support for ensuring equitable access of diagnostics, medicines, vaccines, and technologies to end the COVID-19 pandemic.
What time will that be on Wednesday, Josh?
Yes, ma'am. So we are scheduling our mobilization at 10 in the morning in our at the Department of Trade and Industry, that is in Makati, in their office in front of Hilpuyat Avenue corner, Ayala Avenue.
Diretso na lang doon yung gusto sumama?
Yes, will be the CPRH will be posting the details for the campaign. So we hope to meet everyone before 10 a.m. in the dun sa closest establishment, which is sa Petron, which is at the corner of Ayala Avenue and Hilpuyat, for our mobilization at the Department of Trade and Industry.
Okay, thank you again, Josh and Delen. So if there aren't any more comments or questions, we would like to thank our speakers for this morning's activity, and we hope that we will be able to mobilize more people to support our waiver to support the waiver on the TRIPS, and to our participants, if you can join us in the signature campaign for this call on the government, and maybe we need to also address it to the president. For us, what Councillor Patty said, he is actually the one to give the direction or the move for the DTI and the other members of the cabinet to support the waiver on the TRIPS. So we hope that we will be able to also reach the proper authorities and to support our waiver on the TRIPS, and so thank you to our co-sponsors, the Bantay Bakuna, Council for Health and Development, the People's Health Movement Philippines, the People's Vaccine Alliance of Asia, and Cure COVID. And of course, to also thank you to our media partners, Now You Know and Rappler Move.ph. So thank you very much to everyone who participated in this public briefing. Thank you to our friends from media, from GMA, and Mr. Mark Makalalad, and all the others who were monitoring us through the FB live stream. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Keep safe.
Salamat.